This is Chapter 15 of Mapping the Human Mind. Patrons of the Renaissance. Power, Politics and Progress. The first rays of the New Year's sun filtered through the tall windows of the Medici Bank's headquarters in Florence, casting a soft glow on the cluttered desk where Cosimo de' Medici sat. His fingers, weathered by years of careful labour, moved steadily across a stack of ledgers, each page filled with numbers from branches far and wide, London, Bruges, Venice and beyond. Though his name was whispered in awe across Europe as the wealthiest man alive, Cosimo's appearance was far from that of a grand prince. His simple tunic and the quiet focus in which he worked spoke not of indulgence but of duty, a silent testament to his power. Outside, the city of Florence stirred awake, its bustling streets filled with merchants, artisans and scholars. Yet within the stone walls of the bank, Cosimo's thoughts were not on the coming year's riches, but on the legacy he would leave behind. He had long learned that wealth, though vast, was fleeting. He was said to have remarked, "Fortune and God have given me wealth, and you ask why I build? I cannot take my riches with me when I die, but my buildings and books remain." As the ink of his quill met the parchment, the weight of his words settled deep in his bones. For Cosimo, the city itself, the ideas, the institutions he nurtured, these would endure long after his name was forgotten. But even the grandest dreams require more than vision, they demand resources. While Cosimo's thoughts swirled with lofty ideals and the creation of lasting monuments, the reality of the Renaissance was grounded firmly in the currency of the day. The age of intellectual and artistic awakening required capital. The traditional view of history often keeps art and commerce at a distance, as if the brilliance of the Renaissance flowed unimpeded by the weight of financial support. Yet the truth is far more intertwined. Behind every brushstroke of fresco, every newly translated manuscript, every philosophical treatise that reached eager minds, stood the quiet yet powerful hands of patrons, figures like Cosimo de' Medici, whose wealth and vision made the Renaissance not just possible, but inevitable. The rise of merchant families created new centres of influence outside traditional noble and religious hierarchies. Banking innovations developed by Florentine firms like the Medici created unprecedented wealth. Their double-entry bookkeeping system, which revolutionized financial management, represented Renaissance principles in practice. Observation, systematic recording, and rational analysis applied to commerce. No family embodied this connection between commerce, politics, and culture more than the Medici. Though lacking noble titles, they transformed Florence over generations, through financial acumen, political manoeuvring, and cultural patronage. When the older Cosimo funded the translation of Plato's complete works, his support extended beyond scholarship. It laid a philosophical foundation that subtly legitimized the power of exceptional individuals outside traditional hierarchies. The implication was clear: merit, not just birth, could justify authority. The Renaissance city-states themselves fostered innovation through competition. In 1401, Florence held a public competition for the design of bronze doors for its baptistry. The spectacular trial panels submitted by Ghiberti and Brunelleschi didn't just demonstrate artistic skill, they showcased a society that valued public competition of talent. When Florence later competed with Rome, Venice and Milan to attract the greatest artists and thinkers, it created a marketplace of ideas where innovation flourished. Even political theory began to reshape itself in this changed new environment. In 1513, a middle-aged Niccolò Machiavelli sat in forced retirement at his modest farm outside Florence. Excluded from politics after the Medici returned to power, the former diplomat spent his evenings writing a slim volume that would revolutionize political thought. As he dipped his quill and began each evening's work, he would change from his farming clothes into formal attire, a symbolic gesture of respect for the gravity of political philosophy. "When evening comes, I return home and enter my study," he wrote to a friend. On the threshold I strip off my muddy, sweaty workday clothes and put on the robes of court and palace, and in this grave address I enter the antique courts of the ancients and am welcomed by them. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, he wrote in The Prince. Deliberately contradicting centuries of political thought based on Christian virtue. This wasn't cynicism but a new form of realism. By analysing politics as it was practised rather than as religious authorities said it should be, Machiavelli created a revolutionary approach to understanding power. Just as Renaissance artists studied actual human anatomy rather than idealised forms, Machiavelli dissected political reality rather than repeating idealistic theories. The implications extended beyond theory. When Francis I of France constructed his magnificent chateau at Fontainebleau and imported Italian artists to decorate it, he was using cultural sophistication to legitimise a monarchy increasingly based on practical governance rather than divine right alone. The Renaissance court became a place where power was displayed through mastery of arts and ideas, not just military might. The Renaissance was not a movement without its opposition. In 1497, under the shadow of Florence's majestic cathedral, a fiery spectacle unfolded. At the heart of Piazza della Signoria, a massive bonfire consumed the treasures of the age. Paintings, cosmetics, luxurious garments and books deemed pagan by their critics. Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar leading this incendiary purge, stood before the flames, his gaunt face illuminated by the rising fire, as he condemned the worldliness that had come to define the Renaissance. "Vanity of vanities," he thundered, echoing his familiar refrain as he condemned Florence's obsession with art and opulence. "You have adorned yourselves with the devil's trappings," he warned, "worshipping beauty where your souls wither." Savonarola's brief reign was a powerful counteraction, embodying the tensions that simmered beneath the surface of a world captivated by humanistic ideals. His actions sparked a fierce conflict between religious traditionalism and the burgeoning spirit of innovation. A year later, the flames would turn on Savonarola himself, burned at the stake in the very square where he had once ignited his vision of purification. His death marked a decisive moment, a rejection not only of religious extremism, but of an earlier, more rigid conception of governance. Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, turned its back on the religious dogma that had once dominated its political landscape. Voices emerging from the margins. On a crisp Parisian morning in 1399, a widow sat at her writing desk, quill moving steadily across parchment. At 36, Christine de Pizan had already spent a decade supporting her family through her writing, an occupation virtually unknown for women of her time. The book taking shape beneath her hand would become the Book of the City of Ladies, a work that directly challenged prevailing views on women's intellectual capacity. "I could scarcely find a moral work by any author which doesn't devote some chapter or paragraph to attacking women," she later wrote of her motivation. Christine wasn't really writing, she was building a literary fortress to shelter women's achievements from the siege of misogyny. Despite the Renaissance's focus on human potential, this rebirth wasn't equally distributed. Women encountered new barriers even as men found new opportunities, yet remarkable women carved out unprecedented intellectual spaces for themselves, not just participating in the Renaissance, but helping to define it. Christine de Pizan stands as perhaps the most professional female author in European history. When her husband Etienne died suddenly, leaving her with 3 children, 2 nieces, her mother, and a mountain of debts, Christine didn't retreat to a convent or remarry as convention dictated. Instead, she transformed personal catastrophe into literary innovation. Drawing on the exceptional education her father had provided, defying social norms, in doing so, she turned her knowledge into a profession. If it were the custom to send little girls to school, as is done with boys, and if they were taught the same subjects, they would learn just as well, she wrote in her groundbreaking work. Christine's own life proved the truth of these words. As she gained reputation, she received commissions from nobles and even royalty, including Philip the Bold of Burgundy and the French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. When King Henry IV of England invited her to his court, she politely declined, preferring to remain in France. This marked a rare moment when a female author held enough authority to decline a king's invitation. In Mantua, another extraordinary woman was creating her own Renaissance legacy through different means. In 1419, the 16-year-old Isabella d'Este arrived as a new bride, bringing not just her noble lineage, but remarkable education and artistic sensibility. Over the next decades, she would transform her apartments in the ducal palace into one of Europe's most sophisticated cultural centres. Unlike passive art patrons who simply purchased what was fashionable, Isabella actively shaped artistic production. Her letters to Leonardo da Vinci, preserved in archives, reveal not just requests for paintings, but specific thematic directions and even compositional suggestions. The subject should combine both Christian and classical elements, she wrote to one artist, demonstrating her syncretistic Renaissance vision. Her studiolo became a model Renaissance space, a carefully curated collection of art, antiquities, and natural curiosities that reflected her intellectual range. Visitors described entering this remarkable room where ancient Roman sculptures stood alongside contemporary paintings, exotic shells, and rare manuscripts. When her husband was captured in battle, Isabella successfully ruled Mantua for years, demonstrating that Renaissance women could wield political and cultural influence simultaneously. In Venice, a different kind of female Renaissance unfolded through figures like Veronica Franco. Born to a middle-class family, Franco became a cortangiana onesta, honest courtesan, an elite class of courtesans known for intellectual and artistic accomplishments, alongside physical charms. In her salon near the Grand Canal, she hosted gatherings where senators, artists, and foreign dignitaries engaged in literary discussion and music before any intimate arrangements might occur. A woman's honour is not lost by reason of love, she boldly wrote in her published poetry, challenging the Madonna whore dictonomy that limited female expression. Franco published multiple volumes of poetry and letters, participated in Venice's intellectual circles, and even corresponded with King Henry III of France, who visited her during his state visit to Venice. Her intellectual abilities weren't just socially advantageous, they proved life-saving. When accused before the Inquisition during a period of religious reaction, Franco defended herself with such eloquence that the charges were dropped. The transcript of her testimony reveals not just quick thinking, but substantial knowledge of theology and law, evidencing the serious education she had acquired despite formal exclusion from universities. These women's achievements are all the more remarkable considering the Renaissance saw legal and educational opportunities for women actually decline in many areas. As classical models were revived, so too were ancient Greek and Roman restrictions on female public participation. The Renaissance was never a straightforward march of progress. It contained contradictions that these exceptional women had to navigate through intellect, creativity, and determination. The Church's response. In 1486, Pope Innocent VIII sat in his private chamber in the Vatican, studying a controversial new document with furrowed brow. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's 900 Theses proposed to reconcile all philosophical and religious traditions, not just Christian and classical Greek sources, but Jewish Kabbalah and Islamic philosophy. The document's boldness troubled the aging pontiff. After consultation with advisers, he condemned 13 of Pico's propositions as heretical. Yet just 5 years later, Pico received papal absolution from Innocent's successor, Alexander VI. This reversal exemplifies the complex relationship between the Renaissance and the Church. Not a simple tale of progress versus tradition, but a nuanced dance of resistance, adaptation, and sometimes surprising patronage. The same Vatican that would later place Galileo under house arrest also funded some of the Renaissance's greatest artistic and intellectual achievements. This apparent contradiction reveals an institution wrestling with how to incorporate new ideas while maintaining doctrinal authority, a challenge that would define the Church's relationship with modernity for centuries to come. When humanism began recovering ancient texts, some church leaders initially resisted these pagan influences. Cardinal Bessarion himself, a devoted scholar of Greek philosophy, witnessed tense debates in which traditionalists warned that classical learning threatened Christian purity. In a 1470 letter to a fellow humanist, he defended the study of Plato, noting that many critics opposed what they had never truly studied, implying rather than stating outright that fear often masked ignorance. Yet others recognised opportunity in the classical revival. Thomas Aquinas had already shown that Aristotelian philosophy could be reconciled with Christian theology. Now Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino demonstrated that even Platonic ideas could serve religious understanding. In his academy outside Florence, funded by Cosimo de' Medici, but operating with church tolerance, Ficino developed Christian Platonism. This influenced religious thought across Europe. The Catholic Church's most organised response to Renaissance ideas came through the founding of the Jesuit order in 1540. Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish nobleman turned priest, created a religious community that embraced humanist learning while remaining deeply committed to Catholic orthodoxy. In Jesuit colleges established across Europe, students studied classical literature, rhetoric, and natural philosophy alongside theology. Within their classrooms, young men translated Cicero in the morning and debated religious doctrine in the afternoon, embodying the synthesis the Church was attempting to create between Renaissance learning and Catholic faith. The Jesuits became the intellectual shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, fighting Protestantism not just with piety, but with eloquence, erudition, and educational excellence. Jesuit ministries carried this emphasis across continents. When Matteo Ricci arrived in Ming Dynasty China in 1582, he brought with him not only Christian teachings, but the tools and mindset of Renaissance learning: astronomy, cartography, mathematics, and Western artistic methods. Dressed not as a priest but as a Confucian scholar, Ricci stood before the imperial court explaining European astronomical instruments in fluent Chinese. In that moment, he wasn't just spreading religion, he was offering knowledge as a bridge, showing how the Church could translate its mission through the language of science, culture, and mutual respect. Perhaps most revealingly, the Renaissance papacy itself embodied the period's contradictions. Renaissance popes simultaneously served as spiritual leaders and secular princes, commissioning both religious masterpieces and personal monuments to their own glory. The same Pope Leo X, who excommunicated Martin Luther, also maintained a court of humanist scholars, artists, and musicians. He is said to have once remarked, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," a phrase, whether apocryphal or not, that captured the spirit of Renaissance ecclesiastical excess. This complex dynamic, where the Church both resisted and absorbed Renaissance innovations, reveals something important about institutional adaptation. Rather than simply opposing new ideas, successful institutions often incorporate elements of cultural change while maintaining their core identity. The Church emerged from the Renaissance transformed, but still recognisably itself, having absorbed humanist learning, artistic innovations, and even some philosophical approaches, while holding firm to its fundamental theological positions. The Renaissance beyond Italy. On a winter morning in 1500, Albrecht Dürer stood in his Nuremberg workshop, carefully examining Italian engravings acquired during his recent travels south of the Alps. The German artist had been deeply impressed by the mathematical precision and classical influences of Italian Renaissance art. But he wasn't simply copying these techniques. He was transforming them through his own Northern European sensibilities, more introspective, more spiritually intense, and more morally focused. While Italy was the Renaissance's cradle, its ideas and approaches spread across Europe, adapting to different cultural, religious, and political contexts. The Northern Renaissance wasn't simply a delayed Italian import, it was a distinctive cultural flowering with its own characteristics and priorities. In Rotterdam in 1516, the scholar Desiderius Erasmus sat surrounded by ancient manuscripts in multiple languages. His nearly completed critical edition of the Greek New Testament represented a distinctively Northern Renaissance achievement. While Italian humanists often focused on recovering secular classical texts, Erasmus applied the same philosophical methods to Christian sources. Rather than relying on the Latin Vulgate, he returned to the Greek originals, painstakingly revising the entire New Testament with scholarly precision. His goal was not just accuracy but accessibility. He would later write, "I would have the weakest woman read the Gospels. I would that they were translated into all languages so that they might be read and understood, not only by Scots and Irishmen, but also by Turks and Saracens." It was a bold vision, sacred truth made available to all. His famous work, The Praise of Folly, written while staying with his friend Thomas More in England, satirised religious corruption, but from the perspective of a reformer who sought to revitalise Christianity, not secularise society. When he mocked ignorant monks and corrupt clergy, he wasn't attacking the church itself, but calling it back to what he saw as authentic Christian values. This critical but faithful approach characterised much of Northern Renaissance thought. In the Low Countries, artistic innovation followed a parallel path of adaptation rather than imitation. Jan van Eyck, working in Bruges decades before Dürer, had developed oil painting techniques that achieved unprecedented realism. In his workshop, he mixed linseed oil with pigments, creating translucent layers that captured light with remarkable subtlety. The resulting works, like the Arnolfini portrait 1434, rendered everyday objects with almost miraculous precision. Yet this technical innovation served distinctly Northern sensibilities. While Italian artists often idealised their subjects according to classical standards, Van Eyck presented people as they actually appeared, individual features intact. His religious paintings embedded symbolic objects in realistic domestic settings rather than placing figures in idealised classical environments. This approach reflected Northern Europe's more practical, less classically orientated culture. Dürer himself embodied the cross-fertilisation between Northern and Southern Renaissance traditions. After studying Italian techniques of proportion and perspective during 2 journeys to Venice and Bologna, he incorporated these approaches into his distinctly Germanic sensibility. His famous engraving, Night, Death and the Devil, 1513, shows technical brilliance equal to any Italian master, but his allegorical intensity and moral focus feels unmistakably Northern. The image of a steadfast knight continuing his journey despite being confronted by death and the devil reflected the Northern emphasis on spiritual fortitude rather than external glory. France developed its own distinctive Renaissance, particularly after King Francis I invited Italian artists to his court. In 1516, the king managed a remarkable diplomatic coup by persuading the aging Leonardo da Vinci to leave Italy. When Leonardo arrived at Amboise with paintings including the Mona Lisa, he found a monarch eager to absorb Renaissance culture but adapt it to French royal purposes. The aging Leonardo, his once powerful frame now stooped with age, found unexpected comfort in the French king's patronage. Francis provided him with the manor house of Clos-Lucé near the royal chateau and visited him frequently. eager to absorb the master's genius in his final years. England's Renaissance arrived later still, flowering most visibly during the Elizabethan era. In London theatres around 1600, Shakespeare's plays embodied Renaissance humanism through their psychological complexity and moral ambiguity, rather than through classical references. When Hamlet declares, "What a piece of work is man," he expresses core Renaissance values of human dignity and potential, but in a distinctly English literary voice developed far from the academies of Florence. These regional variations reveal something important about cultural transmission. Ideas don't simply spread unchanged, they transform as they encounter new environments. The Northern Renaissance emphasis on religious reform, practical education, and moral improvement reflected different social needs than those of commercially advanced, politically fractured Italy. As new networks of exchange emerged, through scholars, artists, merchants, and diplomatic ties, Renaissance ideas were adapted to fit distinct cultural and political landscapes. A new way of knowing. In the spring of 1543, a package arrived at the home of Nicolaus Copernicus in Frombork, Poland. The long-established astronomer who had spent decades developing his revolutionary theory that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than vice versa, finally held a printed copy of his masterwork, De Revolutionibus Orbitum Celestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. According to legend, he saw the book on his deathbed, having delayed publication for years, partly out of fear of controversy. That symbolic moment, the dying astronomer finally releasing his world-changing idea, perfectly captured the Renaissance spirit of intellectual courage. The Renaissance didn't just change art, it reshaped the pursuit of knowledge itself. The intellectual optimism of the time encouraged scientific exploration, breaking away from medieval reliance on religious explanations for natural phenomena and ancient authorities who had worked to remain largely unchallenged for centuries. Copernicus's work marked more than an astronomical correction. It triggered a psychological revolution that displaced humanity from the centre of creation. For millennia, both scientific consensus and religious teaching had placed Earth at the centre of the universe, with heavenly bodies revolving around it, a model that reinforced humanity's central place in God's creation. By proposing that the Earth was merely one planet orbiting the Sun, Copernicus initiated what historians would later call the Copernican Revolution, a complete reorientation of humanity's place in the cosmos. Yet, paradoxically, by removing humans from the centre of the physical universe, he elevated them to the status of discoverers, capable of understanding cosmic truths that contradicted both sensory experience and religious tradition. The manuscript circulated cautiously among mathematicians and astronomers before its formal publication. The Lutheran theologian Andreas Osiander, overseeing its printing, added an authorised preface, suggesting the model was merely a mathematical convenience rather than physical reality, an early example of the tensions between religious and scientific worldviews that would intensify in the decades ahead. This scientific revolution, born in the Renaissance principles, would accelerate in the decades and centuries ahead as the cosmos expanded beyond medieval imagination, as human understanding penetrated ever deeper into nature's workings. The vision of potential that had begun with rediscovered manuscripts and reborn artistic expression would transform into modern scientific worldview. A legacy of Renaissance courage and curiosity that continues to shape our understanding of both the universe and ourselves. Yet even as the heavens were being redrawn and nature's laws decoded, another axis of transformation was quietly preparing to rupture, the realm of faith. For while the Renaissance had reawakened the mind, the soul still remained under the Church's strict domain. But that too was about to change, a kind of revolution, less visible than planetary motion but no less powerful, was stirring in the hearts of reformers and the machinery of the printing press. What followed would fracture not only religious unity, but the very nature of truth itself. Next week, the Reformation, when information fractured faith. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.